There is a woman whose name was erased from the Bible, not lost, not forgotten, deliberately removed. And the reason she was removed is the same reason the flood happened. That is not speculation. That is a conclusion that emerges from 6 independent ancient sources, sources that never read each other, never shared a language, and never existed in the same century. Yet they all describe the same sequence of events, the same rebellion, the same corruption, the same catastrophic consequence. By the time this investigation is over, you will understand why certain manuscripts were kept out of the canon. You will understand what the Nephilim actually were and why their existence required a global extinction event. And you will understand the role of a single figure, ancient, feminine, dangerous, whose influence stretches from the Garden of Eden to the moment the sky turned dark and the waters rose above the mountains. If you've never subscribed to this channel, do it now. It takes 2 seconds and it helps more than you know. Every subscriber tells the algorithm this content matters, and that's what keeps these investigations going. The connection has been buried for centuries. Tonight, we unbury it. Before we can understand what was hidden, we need to understand what the official record actually tells us, and more importantly, what it refuses to explain. Genesis 1:27 says something almost no one stops to question. It says God created humanity, male and female, simultaneously. Male and female, He created them. One act, one moment. Both genders together from the same divine breath. Then, in Genesis 2, the story changes. Suddenly, Adam is alone. Suddenly, God puts him to sleep, takes a rib, and fashions a second human from that rib. Her name is Eve. She is described as a helper, a companion, someone formed from Adam's body to complete him. These 2 accounts are presented in sequence in the same book, but they do not describe the same creation event. The rabbinical tradition noticed this centuries ago. The Talmud addressed it, the Midrash addressed it, and a text that was eventually excluded from the Hebrew canon addressed it most directly of all. The question those ancient scholars were asking is simple. If Eve was made from Adam's rib in chapter 2, who was the woman created alongside Adam in chapter 1? The answer is a name, Lilith. Now, before you dismiss that as folklore or medieval superstition, understand something critical. The sources that preserve her story are not fringe texts. They are ancient, they are numerous, and they are deeply uncomfortable for anyone who wants to believe the biblical record is complete. Because if Lilith existed, then the story of the fall is not the beginning. It is the second attempt. The first attempt ended in a rebellion so severe that it required the erasure of an entire human being from sacred history. And the consequences of that rebellion didn't end with her departure from Eden. They continued. They multiplied. Literally. Let us build this case properly. In ancient Hebrew cosmology, the first human, Adam, was formed from the earth, from Adamah. The name is not coincidence. Adam is the earth creature. He is clay animated by divine breath. And according to Genesis 1, he was not alone. The woman created alongside him was formed the same way, from the same earth, by the same act, equal in origin, equal in substance, equal in the moment of her creation. This is the detail that would become a problem, because equality in that garden meant something. It meant she would not submit. The ancient text known as the Alphabet of Ben Sira, composed somewhere between the 8th and 11th centuries, but drawing from traditions far older than its writing, preserves the confrontation directly. When Adam expected dominion, expected her to lie beneath him, to serve beneath him, to exist in relation to him rather than alongside him, she refused. Her argument was theological. She had not been made from him. She had not been made for him. She had been made the same way he had been made, from the same source, in the same moment. She owed him nothing that he did not equally owe her. Adam disagreed, and Lilith left. She did not wait to be cast out. She was not expelled. She walked out of Eden by her own will, pronounced the name of God, the ineffable name, the name too sacred to be spoken, and flew. 3 angels were sent after her, Sinoi, Sansonoi, and Samangeloth. Their mission was to bring her back. She refused to return. And here is where the story stops being mythology and starts being something far more dangerous. Because Lilith did not simply disappear into exile. According to the tradition, she went to a place called the Red Sea, which in ancient symbolism is not a geographical location so much as a boundary, a threshold between the ordered world and the primordial chaos that existed before creation. And there, at that threshold, she made contact with something. The text describes them as demons. Other traditions call them the fallen ones. And in the architecture of ancient theology, these beings have a very specific name. We will return to them, but first, we need to call our first witness. The first witness is not a text, it is a name buried inside the Hebrew language itself. In the book of Isaiah, chapter 34, there is a passage describing the desolation of Edom, a land cursed, abandoned, returned to wilderness. The passage catalogs the creatures that will inhabit this ruined place: owls, jackals, ravens, and then, in verse 14, a word that most modern translations render as night creature or screech owl. The Hebrew word is Lilith. This is not a generic noun. In ancient Semitic languages, this word carries specific weight. It derives from the root lail, meaning night, but its form is personal. It is not describing a type of creature. It is describing a specific being. Isaiah, writing in the 8th century BCE, drops this name into a prophecy about devastation and ruin as though his audience already knows exactly what it means. No explanation is offered. No introduction is given. Lilith belongs in a cursed, desolate landscape, the way ravens and jackals belong there. She is not a metaphor. She is a resident. This is the first convergence, a being whose name means the night associated with wilderness, with exile, with the boundary between the ordered world and the chaos beneath it. And her name is already in the canon, already in the text, already assumed to be known. The editors who assembled the Hebrew Bible included her name in Isaiah and excluded her story from Genesis. That is not an accident. That is a decision. And decisions made about what to include and what to remove from sacred texts are never made without reason. Ask yourself who benefits from a story that begins with Eve rather than Lilith. Ask yourself what changes if the first human woman was not a helper formed from a rib, but an equal formed from the earth who refused submission and made a choice to leave. The answer changes everything about what comes next, because the second witness takes us further. Much further, and what it reveals is not about Lilith alone. It is about what happened after she left. The second witness is the book of Enoch. This text was lost to mainstream Christianity for over 1,000 years. It was excluded from the Hebrew canon. It was excluded from the Christian canon. And yet, fragments of it were preserved in Ethiopia, where the Orthodox Church kept it as scripture. Dead Sea Scroll fragments confirmed its antiquity. It was not written in the medieval period. Portions of it date to at least the 3rd century BCE. The book of Enoch describes something that Genesis 6 mentions in 2 brief, deeply strange verses. The sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days. 2 verses. That is all the canonical Bible gives us. The book of Enoch gives us 200 chapters. It names the leaders of the fallen angels, the Watchers, the Grigori, the beings who descended. It names their crimes. It describes what they taught humanity and what they took from humanity. And it makes clear that their descent was not a random act of lust. It was a deliberate transgression of a cosmic boundary. The Watchers saw the daughters of men and desired them. But in the framework of Enoch, This desire is inseparable from the rebellion that had already occurred in the heavens. There is a chain of defiance, a sequence, a pattern, and in that pattern, the figure at the origin point, the one who first crossed the line between what was meant to be and what was forbidden, is described in terms that map directly onto what earlier traditions say about Lilith. The night, the threshold, the refusal, the corruption that spreads from that original act of independence. The Nephilim, the offspring of these forbidden unions, were not simply large. They were not simply violent. They were a contamination of the created order. And they were what happens when the boundary between the divine and the human is deliberately, repeatedly, catastrophically violated. And God's response to that contamination was not a warning, it was water. But before we reach the flood, we need to hear from a third witness, one that most people would never expect to be called to this stand. The third witness comes from ancient Mesopotamia. The Sumerians were writing before Moses was born. Their civilization was already ancient when Abraham left Ur. And in their mythological archive, there is a figure whose description is so parallel to Lilith's that scholars have debated the connection for 2 centuries. Her name is Lamashtu. She is depicted in Sumerian and Babylonian texts as a female demon associated with the night, with childbirth and its dangers, with the deaths of infants. So with the wilderness and the threshold, she is the one who comes to the boundary between life and death and crosses it without permission. She cannot be domesticated. She cannot be controlled. She is driven away with amulets and incantations. But what makes Lamashtu relevant here is not just her characteristics. It is her origin story. In Mesopotamian theology, Lamashtu is the daughter of the sky god Anu, the supreme deity of the heavens. She is divine in origin. She is not a creature made from chaos. She is a daughter of order who chose chaos. She was expelled from the heavens for her refusal to submit to the divine hierarchy. Sound familiar? Equal in origin to the divine, refusing submission, departing of her own will, taking up residence at the boundaries associated with the corruption of human bloodlines. A civilization that never read Genesis, a culture that predates the Hebrew written tradition by centuries, and they have the same story. That is not coincidence. That is memory. Something happened, something so significant that multiple civilizations, separated by geography, separated by language, separated by theology, all remembered it the same way. They changed the names, they adjusted the details to fit their cosmologies. But the structure remained, a feminine force, divine in origin, refusing to remain in the order assigned to her, departing, making contact with beings at the edge of the created world, and through that contact beginning a contamination that would eventually require catastrophic intervention. The fourth witness speaks from across the ocean of time, from a tradition so ancient that its texts were composed in a language no longer fully understood. The Zohar, the central text of Jewish mysticism, compiled in the 13th century, but preserving oral and esoteric traditions far older, does not shy away from Lilith. In Cabalistic cosmology, Lilith is not a minor figure. She is not a footnote. She is one of the most significant beings in the entire metaphysical architecture of creation. She is paired with Samael, the angel of death, the accuser, the being many traditions identify with the adversary. Together, they are described as a force of uncreation, a dark mirror of the divine union, a union of rebellion. The Zohar states explicitly that after Lilith's departure from Eden, she became the consort of the great demon, that she produced offspring, and that those offspring populated the world alongside humanity, invisible, corrupting, multiplying. In Cabalistic terms, every act of creation has a shadow. Every divine emanation has a corresponding dark emanation. Lilith is not evil in the simple sense. She is the shadow of the feminine divine, the part of creation that refused to be contained, and in her refusal, She became the vessel through which the forces of dissolution entered the world. This is not medieval superstition. This is a coherent theological framework built across centuries by some of the most rigorous religious scholars in human history. They were not writing fantasy. They were trying to explain something they believed had actually happened. And what they believed had happened connects directly to the fifth witness. The fifth witness is the one that ties everything together, the one that makes the flood not just a punishment, but a necessity. Return to Genesis 6. Return to those 2 verses. The sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. In Hebrew, the phrase translated as sons of God is B'nai Elohim. This phrase appears elsewhere in the Hebrew Scriptures, in Job, in Psalms, and in every other instance it refers unambiguously to divine beings. Angels, members of the heavenly court, these were not righteous human lineages, as some traditions later argued. They were beings from beyond the created human order who descended and violated the boundary between the divine and the human, and their offspring, the Nephilim, are described in the very next verse as the mighty men who were of old. Are the men of renown? What the canonical text does not tell you, what it compresses into those 2 verses, is the full scope of what the Nephilim were and what they did. The book of Enoch fills the gap. The Watchers taught humanity forbidden knowledge, metalworking for weapons, sorcery, the reading of signs and enchantments, cosmetics that the text associates specifically with seduction, the tools of corruption. They did not simply produce offspring with human women. They systematically dismantled the order of creation. They corrupted the genetic inheritance of humanity. They corrupted the animal kingdom. They corrupted the knowledge base of civilization. And at the center of that corruption, in the architecture of the tradition we have been building across these witnesses, is the original transgression, on the one who first refused the created order, the one who first sought union with the forces at the threshold, the one whose name means the night. The flood was not sent because humanity had become wicked in the ordinary sense, greedy, violent, dishonest. The flood was sent because the created order itself had been contaminated. The separation between the human and the divine, between the ordered world and the primordial chaos, had been so thoroughly violated that there was no surgical solution, no partial correction, no reform. There was only reset. Only Noah and his family, described as perfect in their generations, a phrase the ancient commentators consistently interpret as meaning uncorrupted in their genetic inheritance, untouched by the contamination of the Nephilim bloodlines, were preserved. Everything else went under the water. Now connect the full chain. A woman equal in origin to Adam refuses the hierarchy of the created order and departs Eden. She takes up residence at the boundary of chaos. She unites with the forces of dissolution. The tradition records that she produces offspring, beings that exist at the threshold of the human and the inhuman. Then the Watchers, the sons of God, descend and take human women. Their offspring, the Nephilim, accelerate the contamination. The corruption spreads until it threatens to consume everything. And God sends the flood. The book of Enoch does not present these as separate events. They are one continuous narrative. The original rebellion in the garden, the refusal of order, is the seed. The descent of the Watchers is the growth. The Nephilim are the harvest. The flood is the only possible response. You were never meant to understand this as a story about weather. Now we arrive at the moment this investigation has been building toward. Because if this reading is correct, if the erasure of Lilith from Genesis and the marginalization of the book of Enoch were deliberate acts of editorial control, then the question is no longer historical. The question is present tense. What else was removed? The scholars who assembled the canon were not naive. They were not working randomly. They made decisions about what to include and what to exclude based on what they wanted the theology to be. And the theology they wanted did not have room for a first woman who chose her own path. It did not have room for a detailed account of angelic rebellion that implicated the divine in something catastrophic. It did not have room for a cosmology in which the forces of dissolution are not defeated but ongoing, still present, still active, still capable of corruption. The official record is clean. The hidden record is not. Ancient Mesopotamia remembered a divine woman who refused submission and was expelled, and they called her a demon. The Hebrew prophets dropped her name into Scripture as though she needed no introduction, and the editors did not remove it. The Book of Enoch, found in caves and preserved in Ethiopia, describes a contamination of the human bloodline so severe that it required planetary destruction, and it was kept out of the canon. The Cabalists built an entire metaphysical framework around her continued existence and ongoing influence, and they were the most serious scholars in the Jewish tradition. So these sources are not telling different stories. They are telling the same story from different angles, and the story ends, or rather does not end, with the waters receding and Noah stepping out onto a world that was clean but not empty. The Nephilim, according to some traditions, did not all die in the flood. The text of Genesis 6 says, "The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward." Those two words, also afterward. The contamination that began with a refusal in a garden did not end with 40 days of rain. It continued, which means the question you should be sitting with right now is not just about the ancient world. It is about this one. If the created order was deliberately contaminated, and if the contamination survived the attempt to erase it, and if the sources closest to the event were systematically excluded from the texts that shaped Western civilization, then what we call history may be missing its most important chapter. The erasure of Lilith from Genesis was not about protecting a theological idea. It was about protecting a narrative in which the rebellion has a clear beginning, a clear middle, and a reassuring resolution. The hidden record suggests the resolution has not yet arrived. We are still living in the afterward. If this investigation opens something in you, if you feel that you have been looking at an incomplete picture and this is the first time someone has shown you the full frame, then do not let the algorithm bury it. Like this video. Subscribe to this channel. Not as a formality, and not as a reflex, but because this kind of content takes research, takes time, and takes an audience willing to demand it. Every subscriber tells the platform that there are people who want to know what was hidden. Every like is a signal that this conversation should continue. The next investigation goes deeper, and you will want to be there when it does.